I'm Ruth Easton, 57 years old, and I went from a small town in Ohio where my own father told me the Army was no place for a girl, to wearing 4 stars as one of the most senior generals in the country. For 35 years, I let my work speak for me instead of my voice, and I never once raised it to demand the respect I had earned. But when a colonel at a black tie gala looked right past me, called me sweetheart, and sent me to wait with the aides, the truth caught up with him in a way I never could have staged. Have you ever been dismissed as nobody by someone who never bothered to look at you? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you are tuning in from. And if you have ever had to stand up for yourself after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe. The morning of the gala, my dress uniform hung on the back of the closet door, and the 4 stars on each shoulder caught the gray light coming through the window. I stood there longer than I needed to, the way a person does when a day already feels heavier than the calendar says it should. Rain was coming. I could smell it through the screen. And underneath the quiet of that morning was a feeling I had carried for 35 years, the feeling of a woman who has spent a lifetime being told to wait in the smaller room. By that evening, a colonel I had never met would look right past me and send me to wait with the aides. I want to tell you everything that came before it, every year of it, so that you understand why, when he did it, I simply said, "Of course," and stepped back into the hallway. I did not correct him. I did not raise my voice. I had learned a long time ago that the truth does not need me to argue for it. It only needs me to outlast the people who get it wrong. To understand that, you have to go back to a kitchen table in Ohio. I grew up in a small town outside Dayton, in a house where my father worked the line at a parts plant and believed the world was arranged in a sensible order that a person was foolish to question. Harold Easton was not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that because it matters to everything that came after. He coached my brother's baseball teams and fixed the neighbors' cars for free and never once raised a hand to anyone. He simply knew, the way some men know things without ever examining them, that certain doors were not built for his daughter. I was 16 the night I told him I wanted to go to West Point. We were at the table. My mother, June, had made a pot roast, and the smell of it is one of those memories that stays attached to a moment for the rest of your life. I said the words out loud that I wanted to be an officer in the Army, and my father set down his fork and looked at me with something close to tenderness, which somehow made it worse. "The Army's no place for a girl, Ruthie," he said. "You'll be home by Christmas." He did not say it to wound me. He said it the way you tell a child the stove is hot. He believed he was protecting me from a disappointment he could already see coming. My mother did not argue with him at the table, because that was not how their marriage worked, but later that night, she came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed and told me she had filled out the request for my congressional nomination herself and mailed it that afternoon. She did not make a speech about it. She just squeezed my hand once and turned off the light. That was the first time I understood something that would shape the next 3.5 decades of my life. Some people decide who you are before you ever open your mouth, and you cannot argue them out of it. You can only outlast them. My mother taught me to keep moving quietly while other people made their pronouncements. My father, without ever meaning to, taught me that competence is the only argument that ever really lands because it does not require the other person to admit they were wrong. It just makes their being wrong obvious to everyone in the room. I went to West Point in the fall of 1987. I will not pretend it was easy, or that I floated through it on principle. I was cold and exhausted and homesick for 2 years, and there were mornings I lay in my bunk and heard my father's voice telling me I would be home by Christmas, and the only thing that got me up was a stubbornness I had inherited, ironically, from him. I graduated and was commissioned a second lieutenant in the spring of 1991. My father came to the ceremony in a suit that was a little too tight, and when he shook my hand, he told me, quietly, that he still thought I would quit within a year. I did not argue. I had stopped arguing with him by then. I just kept showing up. I chose aviation because the first time I sat in a cockpit, something in me went still, and certain in a way nothing else ever had. Flight school was at a sprawling post in the South, and that is where I met the second person who shaped me, a captain named Frank Delaney, who was assigned as one of my instructors. Frank was the first man in a uniform who looked at me and saw an officer instead of a problem to be managed. He was hard on me, harder than he was on the men, but it was a different kind of hard. It was the hardness of someone who has already decided you belong and refuses to let you waste it. I remember a training flight late in the program, a rough one, weather coming in, and I brought the aircraft down clean while my hands wanted to shake. Frank was quiet for a moment in the headset. Then he said something I have carried into every command I have ever held. "You don't fly like someone trying to prove something," he said. "You fly like someone who already knows. Hold on to that." I did not know it then, but that sentence was the whole map of my career. I would spend the next 34 years in rooms full of people who assumed I was trying to prove something, and the thing that carried me through every one of them was the quiet certainty Frank named on that flight. I already knew. I did not have to convince anyone. I just had to keep flying. The first time I lifted off solo, the post falling away beneath me, my father's voice did not follow me up into the air. For the length of that flight, there was no kitchen table, no Christmas, no list of doors that were not built for me. There was only the aircraft and the sky and a woman who had finally found the one place in the world where no one had gotten to her first. I leveled off and keyed the radio and heard Frank, somewhere below, tell me I was already home. I believed him. It would take the rest of the world a little longer to catch up. People assume that rank fixes the problem. They think that if you climb high enough, the assumptions stop, that somewhere above the clouds there's a line you cross after which no one mistakes you for the help. I am here to tell you that is not how it works. I pinned on 4 stars, and people still handed me their coats. The only thing that changed over 34 years was that I stopped being surprised by it. The first time it happened in a way I remember clearly, I was a major. It was the spring of 2003, and I was deployed to Iraq, running the air plan for a task force out of a plywood operations center that smelled like dust and diesel. A delegation of civilian officials flew in to be briefed, important men in pressed khakis who had clearly been told that someone senior would walk them through the picture. I met them at the door. The lead man looked at me, then passed me and handed me his jacket and his sunglasses without a word, the way you hand things to a coat check. I took them. I hung the jacket on a hook by the door. Then I walked to the front of the room, picked up the laser pointer, and briefed them on the air operation. They had crossed an ocean to understand. I watched it land on the lead man's face about 30 seconds in. The slow horror of a person realizing the coat check was the major running the show. He apologized afterward, profusely, and I told him it was no trouble, which was true because by then I had already filed it away with all the others. That night I sat with Sandra Okafor, who had been my classmate at West Point and was deployed a few tents over. Sandra was the one person in the world I never had to perform for. She poured 2 cups of coffee that tasted like a battery and looked at me across the plywood and asked the question she always asked. "Doesn't it make you furious?" she said. "It used to," I told her. "Now I just let the room figure it out on its own. It always does." Sandra shook her head. She did not think I was wrong, exactly. She thought I was too patient, that one day my patience would meet a moment that deserved something louder. "One day," she said, "someone is going to do it in front of the wrong crowd, at the wrong time, and you are going to enjoy not saying a word." I laughed and told her I would let her know. The years went by the way years do in a career like mine, in a blur of moves and deployments and commands that each felt enormous, while I was in them and small the moment I handed them off. I took a battalion of helicopters to Afghanistan as a lieutenant colonel in 2008. I commanded a combat aviation brigade as a colonel in 2013. I pinned on my first star in 2016, my second in 2019, my third in 2022. And at every single level, without fail, there was a moment when a stranger looked at me and decided I was someone's assistant. A 4-star general once asked me to refill his water glass at a conference because he assumed I was staff. A senator's aide tried to wave me out of a secure room I was about to brief in. A young officer at a reception, meaning no harm, asked me whose wife I was. I refilled the glass. I showed the aide my badge. I told the young officer I was nobody's wife, I was the division commander, and watched him want to disappear into the floor. None of it made me angry anymore. It had stopped being an insult and become a kind of weather, something that happened to me regardless of how high I climbed, like rain that did not care about my rank. There were harder moments than the coats, of course. I do not want to leave you with the impression that 34 years was nothing but men handing me their jackets. I buried soldiers. I wrote letters to mothers that I rewrote a dozen times and never got right. I missed birthdays and anniversaries and the slow, ordinary middle of my own life. But even in the hardest of it, the underestimation followed me like a shadow that did not care whether the sun was out. A general I was briefing once cut me off to ask whether the actual planner could come in. The actual planner was me. I had been awake for 2 days building the thing he was about to approve. I told him so, evenly, and watched him decide I was being difficult. You learn, after enough of those, that you can spend your life being angry or you can spend it being good at the job, and that you rarely have the energy for both. In the spring of 2025, I pinned on my 4th star and took command of Army Forces Command, the largest command in the Army, responsible for hundreds of thousands of soldiers. I was the first woman to hold the post. At the change of command ceremony, with the flags snapping and the band playing, a reporter found me afterward and asked whose idea it had been to put, in her words, a female face on the command. She did not ask about my 34 years. She did not ask about Iraq or Afghanistan, or the brigade I had rebuilt, or the soldiers I had buried. She asked whose idea the face had been. I answered her with my record, because that is the only answer I have ever trusted. I told her about the missions and the commands and the years, and I let the facts do what facts do, which is sit in a room until everyone stops pretending. Sandra, retired by then, was in the audience. She caught my eye and shook her head, slow, and I knew exactly what she was thinking, because she had said it to me in a tent 22 years before. One day, the wrong crowd, the wrong moment, and the pleasure of not saying a word. I did not know it yet, but that moment was a little more than a year away, and it would arrive in the form of a colonel with a clipboard who could not be bothered to look up. The gala was held in a hotel ballroom downtown, one of those grand old rooms with chandeliers the size of small cars and carpet that swallows the sound of your footsteps. It was the anniversary celebration of the Aviation Association, the organization that had quietly held the aviation community together for decades. And Frank Delaney, my old flight instructor, now retired with 4 stars of his own and serving as the association's president, had asked me months earlier to be the guest of honor. I had said yes before he finished the sentence. There are not many people I would cross a country for. Frank is one of them. I have a habit my detail finds mildly maddening. I like to arrive early and quietly, before the noise, before the receiving lines and the photographers. It is the one piece of the old anonymity I still get to keep. So I came in a side entrance about 40 minutes before the principal's reception was set to begin, my protective detail staging outside, per my preference, just 2 of them shadowing me in through the service corridor while the rest held the vehicles. It was raining hard by then, and I had a dark evening cape over my shoulders against the weather, the kind a woman wears over dress blues so the rain does not ruin the wool. It happened to cover my shoulders completely. It happened to cover the 4 stars. The corridor outside the principal's reception room was bright and busy with the particular chaos that precedes a formal event. And standing at the door, with a clipboard and a printed seating chart and the bearing of a man who has decided that controlling a doorway is the same thing as being important, was a colonel I had never met. His name, I would learn, was Preston Gaines, and he was the event chairman, the officer in charge of running the reception and managing who went where. He was immaculate, his uniform was perfect, and he was looking down at his seating chart the way some men look at a phone, as a way of not having to look at the people in front of them. Down the hall, in a small anteroom, a cluster of junior aides waited to be told what to do, including a young second lieutenant who looked like she might be sick from nerves. I stepped toward the reception room door. Colonel Gaines did not look up. He registered a woman approaching, a woman in a dark cape with no visible rank, a woman he did not recognize and therefore filed instantly into the only category his evening had room for. "Aides, wait down the hall, sweetheart," he said, eyes on his chart, pen moving. "This room is principals only." One of the staffers beside him, a sergeant first class who did a double take at my face, started to say something. "Sir, I think that's, that might be." Gaines talked right over her, the way he had probably talked over people his entire career. "Down the hall. Thank you." He waved his pen toward the anteroom without ever lifting his eyes. "Now, I want you to understand the choice I made in that second, because it is the heart of this whole story. I could have dropped the cape from my shoulders. I could have let the 4 stars catch the light and watch the color drain out of his face right there. Sandra would have. A younger version of me might have. But I am 57 years old, and I have spent a lifetime learning that the loudest thing in any room is the truth, and the truth never needs my help. So I did the thing I have always done. "Of course," I said, and I turned and walked down the hall to wait with the aides. The anteroom was small and warm and smelled like coffee from a cart in the corner. The young second lieutenant, whose name was Grace Albright, was standing very straight against the wall, terrified of doing something wrong on what was clearly one of the biggest nights of her young career. She kept smoothing the front of her uniform and checking a list that she had already checked. I sat down in one of the chairs along the wall, cape still on, and watched her for a moment and saw a younger version of myself so clearly it almost hurt. "Breathe," I told her gently. "Nobody here is as important as they're acting." She gave me a small, grateful, panicked laugh. She thought I was a fellow aide, an older woman from some office staff, here to ferry name cards like she was. She had no idea. Nobody in that anteroom had any idea. The guest of honor, the 4-star commander of the largest command in the army, the woman whose name was printed at the top of Colonel Gaines's own seating chart, was sitting in a folding chair among the staff because a man with a clipboard could not be bothered to raise his eyes. I thought about Sandra while I sat there, about the plywood tent and the prophecy she had made over battery acid coffee. The wrong crowd. The wrong moment. I almost laughed. Here it was, finally, the moment she had promised me, a colonel who had dismissed a 4-star general in front of a ballroom full of people who would spend the rest of the night finding out about it, and the only thing required of me was to do nothing at all. I had spent 34 years training for a discipline most people never learn, the discipline of letting an injustice stand for 60 more seconds because you know the truth is already on its way, and your interference would only rob it of its force. Grace kept glancing at the door, waiting to be useful, and I told her again to sit, that her moment would come, and it would come whether or not she wore herself out worrying about it. She did not know she was taking the most important lesson of her career from a woman in a folding chair. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap and a small private smile on my face. And down the hall, a colonel checked names off a list, completely unaware that he had just made the worst mistake of his evening and that it was already too late to take it back. It took about 10 minutes for the rest of my detail to come in out of the rain, and when they did, the evening changed shape so fast that people would talk about it for a long time afterward. Master Sergeant Dominic Reyes had been the lead of my protective detail for the better part of a year. He was a calm, square-shouldered man who wore a dark suit and an earpiece and missed nothing. The kind of professional who could walk into a crowded room and tell you in 4 seconds where every exit was and which person was a problem. When the vehicles were set and the building was cleared to his satisfaction, he came looking for his principal, which is to say he came looking for me, and he was not expecting to find me in a staff anteroom down a side hall. He stepped into the doorway, scanned the room once, and found me in the folding chair. Something flickered across his face, a professional's quick recalculation of how I had ended up there, and then it was gone, replaced by the flat courtesy he always used on the job. "Ma'am," he said, "we're ready for you." Grace Albright's head turned. The other aides went quiet. Reyes did not explain anything. He simply keyed his radio, said a few low words, and 2 more members of the detail came through from the corridor and moved past us toward the principal's reception room, the room I had been turned away from 10 minutes earlier. What happened next I did not orchestrate. I want to be honest about that. I did not signal it or arrange it. It is simply what a protective detail does when the principal moves, and it is the same whether the principal is a 4-star general or a head of state. Reyes walked into the reception room ahead of me, and his voice, when it came, was level and carrying and left no room for discussion. "Clear the floor," he said. "The general is moving." I have been told what it looked like from inside that room, because Frank described it to me later with a great deal of satisfaction. The detail spread out, men in dark suits with their arms wide, easing the guests back toward the walls to open a path. The conversation died. The clink of glasses stopped. And Colonel Preston Gaines, standing near the center of the room with his clipboard, found a member of my detail stepping up beside him, a hand settling on his shoulder, guiding him firmly out of the way, like everyone else. I stepped into the doorway. I reached up and unclasped the cape, and I let it fall from my shoulders into the waiting hand of one of my detail. And the 4 stars on each shoulder caught the light of those enormous chandeliers. I watched it cross Gaines's face. I will not pretend I took no notice of it, because I did. I saw the exact moment the woman in the cape, the aide he had sent down the hall, the sweetheart he could not be bothered to look at, became the 4-star guest of honor whose name sat at the top of his own chart. The color went out of him. His mouth opened and found nothing to say. The hand on his shoulder was still there, holding him gently to the side. While the room he had been so proud to control reorganized itself entirely around a woman he had dismissed without a glance. I did not look at him. I want you to understand that too, because it was the most deliberate thing I did all night. I did not need to look at him. Looking at him would have made it about him, and it was never about him. It was. I walked through the path my detail had opened, and across the room I saw Frank Delaney, 71 years old and grinning like a boy, crossing toward me with his arms out. "There she is," he said, and folded me into an embrace, and the whole room understood at once exactly who had been sitting with the aides. Frank told me afterward that the silence in the room was the strangest part, the way 100 conversations stopped at once, the way people who had been laughing a moment before set down their glasses and watched a path open across the carpet for a woman they had not noticed arrive. He said you could see the calculation move through the crowd, person by person, as they realized what they were watching, and then he said the part I have thought about many times since. He said the only person who did not seem surprised was an old retired sergeant working the coat room, who looked at the 4 stars and at Gaines's white face and nodded once, slowly, like a man watching the weather finally do what he had known it would do all along. I think that sergeant understood the whole thing better than anyone in that ballroom in their dress uniforms. He had been the one taking the coats. He knew exactly how the room treated the people who take the coats. Later that night, alone in my hotel room, with the cape folded over a chair and the 4 stars sat on the dresser, I felt the thing I always feel after these moments, which is not triumph. It is something quieter and more tired than that. I thought about my father at the kitchen table, telling me I would be home by Christmas. I thought about all the coats I had hung up over 34 years, and I understood, the way you understand a thing you have always known, that I had spent my whole life proving a small, quiet point to people who were never really looking, and that the proving had never once made me feel the way they imagined it would. My phone rang. It was Sandra. The story had already reached her, the way these stories do. "You didn't say a word, did you?" she said. It was not really a question. "I didn't have to," I told her. That was the whole point. She was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed, soft and low, the laugh of a friend who had predicted this exact night in a plywood tent 22 years before. "I told you," she said. "The wrong crowd, the wrong moment, and you enjoyed not saying a word." I did. God help me, after a lifetime of patience, I did. The apology came faster than I expected, and in exactly the wrong shape. Colonel Gaines found me near the end of the evening, after the dinner and the speeches, when the ballroom had thinned and the band was packing up. He came toward me with his hands slightly raised, his face a careful arrangement of contrition, and I could tell before he opened his mouth that the apology he had rehearsed in the last 2 hours was not really an apology to me. It was an apology to his own career. "Ma'am," he said. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. If I'd known who you were, I never would have." I let him get that far, and then I stopped him, gently, because the sentence he was building was the whole problem, and I wanted him to hear it before he finished it. "That's the problem, Colonel," I said. "You should not have to know who someone is to treat them like a person." He blinked. I do not think anyone had said anything like that to him in a very long time, if ever. Men like Preston Gaines build their whole lives around knowing exactly who someone is, around sorting every face into a tier and adjusting their warmth accordingly. The idea that the sorting itself was the failure, rather than the unlucky fact that he had sorted a 4-star into the wrong tier, was genuinely new to him, and I watched him struggle with it. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do next, because it matters. I did not file a complaint. I did not call his commander that night demanding his head. I have seen too many careers ended over a single bad night, and I did not believe one rude moment at a doorway should erase a man's decades of service. But I also did not let him off the hook with a warm word and a pat on the arm, because that would have taught him nothing, and a man who learns nothing simply does it again to someone who cannot drop a cape and reveal 4 stars. So I told him the truth, plainly. I told him that every person in that room had seen how he treated a woman he believed was nobody. I told him that he was responsible for the room he ran, and that the way he ran a doorway said more about him than any evaluation ever would. And I told him that I hoped he would spend some real time thinking about who he waved off when he assumed no one important was watching. Because those were the moments that revealed a man, not the moments when the stars were in plain sight. He nodded through all of it. Whether it landed, I could not tell yet. The consequence, when it came, did not come from me at all. It came from his own side of the house, which is the way these things should work. Brigadier General Neil Dunmore was my chief of staff at Forces Command, and he had been in that ballroom, and he had seen the whole thing unfold from 20 feet away. Neil was not a dramatic man, but he was a man who paid attention, and what he had seen at that doorway confirmed something he had apparently been wondering about Gaines for a while. He pulled the colonel aside before the night was over. I was not there for it, but Neil told me the shape of it afterward. He told Gaines in so many words that this was not about embarrassing a 4-star because I was the last person in the building who needed defending. It was about a pattern. It was about the fact that Neil had now seen, with his own eyes, exactly how Preston Gaines treated people he believed had nothing to offer him. "She's not the one you have to worry about, Preston," Neil told him. "It's everyone you've ever talked to like that when the stars weren't in the room." That sentence, I think, did what my sentence could not. It took the comfortable story Gaines had been telling himself, the story where he had simply made an unlucky mistake about one important person, and it replaced that story with a much harder one. The story of a man whose default setting had finally been witnessed by someone who could not be charmed out of remembering it. I have thought a great deal about why Neil's sentence worked when mine did not. I think it was because I was the wronged party, and an apology offered to the person you have wronged can always be discounted as politics, as the smart move, as the thing you say to a 4-star who could end you. But Neil was not wronged. Neil had nothing to gain. When a peer who owes you nothing tells you what he saw, plainly and without heat, there is nowhere left to hide, because you cannot accuse him of overreacting on his own behalf. He was not overreacting on anyone's behalf. He was simply telling Gaines the truth about himself. And the truth, as I have said, is the loudest thing in any room. When Sandra and I talked the next morning, I told her the part that actually mattered to me, the part that had nothing to do with Gaines's career. The gala wasn't about him, I said. It was about every young soldier he's ever treated the way he treated me when he thought I was nobody. Those are the ones I care about. He'll be fine. They're the ones who get told to wait in the hallway and never get to drop a cape. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said the thing she has said to me more than once over 35 years of friendship. "That," she said, "is why they made you a general and not me." I told her that was not true, that she would have made a better general than I ever did, and we both knew I half meant it. But I also knew what she was pointing at. The win, if there was one, was never going to be Preston Gaines standing in an emptying ballroom, realizing he had been seen clearly for the first time in years. The win was going to be what I did with the moment afterward. And I already knew what that was going to be. Her name was Grace Albright, and she was 23 years old, and she had been the only person in that anteroom who treated the people around her like they mattered. In the weeks that followed, 2 things happened at the same time, and they moved in opposite directions. The first was that Preston Gaines's world quietly tightened. I did not lift a finger to make it happen, and that is exactly why it was so complete. These stories travel on their own. By the time a month had passed, the account of the colonel who sent a 4-star to wait with the aides had made its way through the aviation community the way every good story does, in lowered voices at coffee bars and in the pause before a meeting started. And here's the thing about a story like that. It does not invent a man's reputation. It confirms one. Everyone who had ever felt the cool edge of Gaines's condescension, everyone who had ever been a junior officer he looked through, now had a name for the thing they had felt and a story to hang it on. His chain of command began, very quietly, to reassess him. Not dramatically. No one relieved him or ended his career. But the assignments that had once seemed inevitable began to drift toward other people. And the rooms he had always been welcome in grew a degree cooler. And a man who had spent his whole life trading on access discovered that access is a currency that loses value the moment people decide you are not generous with it. He was not destroyed. He was simply, finally, accurately understood, which for a man like Gaines may have been worse. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make this sound like justice arriving on schedule, and life is rarely that tidy. Gaines did not lose his pension or his rank. He went home every night to a family who loved him and a house he had earned. The cost he paid was subtler and, I think, more honest than any formal punishment would have been. It was the cost of being known. For 26 years he had moved through the army, trading on the impression he made on the people above him, and he had been very good at it. And the gala did not erase any of that, so much as it added a footnote that traveled alongside his name from then on. People are complicated. He was a good officer in many of the ways the army measures, and a small man in the one way it usually fails to measure at all. The story simply made the second thing visible to people who had only ever been shown the first. The second thing that happened was Grace Albright. About 3 weeks after the gala, I had my staff reach out to her chain of command and request that Second Lieutenant Albright be detailed to my headquarters for a short mentoring rotation. When she arrived, standing very straight in my outer office, she looked as terrified as she had in that anteroom, and I realized she still did not entirely understand what had happened that night, or that the older woman who had told her to breathe had been the guest of honor the whole time. I sat her down and I told her the truth, all of it, and I watched her piece it together, and then I told her why she was standing in my office. Because you were the only person in that anteroom who treated the people around you like they mattered, I said. You were scared out of your mind and you were still kind. I noticed. I always notice that. It is the rarest thing in this army, and it is the only thing I have ever found that actually predicts what kind of officer someone becomes. She did not know what to say. She said thank you, ma'am, about 4 times. But over the weeks she spent around my headquarters, I watched something settle in her. A sense that the qualities she had been quietly worried made her too soft for this life were in fact the exact qualities that had brought her to the attention of a 4-star general. She started standing straight because she belonged, not because she was afraid. I gave her real work, not coffee runs. I put her in the corner of meetings where decisions were actually made, and I made her brief me, badly at first, and then well, because the fastest way to teach a young officer that she belongs in a room is to make her responsible for something in it. She made mistakes. I let her. The only mistake I ever corrected hard was the day she apologized for taking up my time, and I told her, more sharply than I meant to, that she was never again to apologize for occupying a space she had earned, that there were enough people in the world ready to tell her she did not belong without her doing their work for them. Gaines, to his limited credit, began to change too, slowly and against his own grain. I heard about it secondhand, the way I heard about everything. There was a young soldier he would once have walked straight past, and this time, the story went, he stopped and learned the kid's name. It was a small thing, but the whole point of what I believe about people is that they are made of small things, and that a man who catches himself once can catch himself again, and that change does not have to be total to be real. Somewhere in those weeks, I drove out to see my father. Harold was 84 by then, slower, his big factory hands gone soft and spotted, his certainty worn down by the years the way a river wears down a stone. He had followed my career from a distance for decades, never quite saying what he felt about it, and I had stopped needing him to. But that afternoon, sitting on his porch with the same kind of rain coming that had come the night of the gala, I told him the story. The colonel, the cape, the anteroom, the 4 stars. He listened to the whole thing without saying a word. And when I finished, he looked out at the rain for a long moment, and something moved in his face that I had been waiting most of my life to see. Revenge would have been easy, I told him, and small. I wanted something that would still matter after everyone forgot the colonel's name. My father nodded slowly. He did not say the thing yet. That would come later. But he reached over and put his soft old hand on top of mine. And for once in his life, Harold Easton did not tell me what I could not do. Gaines asked to see me again about 2 months after the gala, and this time the meeting was different from the first. He came to my headquarters, which took a certain amount of courage given what the building represented, and he sat across from my desk, and he did not lead with, "If I'd known." That absence told me more than anything he could have said. He had clearly spent the weeks since the gala turning the thing over, and what he had found at the bottom of it was not the unlucky story he had wanted, but the harder one Neil Dunmore had handed him in the emptying ballroom. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how many people I never looked at. Over 26 years. I genuinely do not know the number, ma'am, and that is the part that has been keeping me up. I'd like that to stop being true." I let that sit in the room for a moment because it deserved the respect of not being answered too quickly. "I'm glad to hear it," I told him. "But I want to be honest with you about something, Colonel. The apology you owe is not to me. I dropped a cape and turned out to be a general, and the whole thing became a story people tell. I am the last person in this who was actually harmed. The people you owe are the ones who waited in hallways and never got to reveal anything, because they really were exactly who you assumed they were. A young soldier, a junior aide, a person with nothing to offer your career. You cannot apologize to all of them. There are too many, and you do not know their names, so you are going to have to do it a different way." He asked me what way. I had thought about this. I told him that the association ran a junior officer development program, the kind of unglamorous mentoring work that men like Gaines usually avoided because it offered no access and no shine. I told him I thought he should run it. The man whose entire failure had been a refusal to see junior people clearly should spend the next few years doing nothing but seeing them, learning their names, opening doors for them instead of guarding doors against them. It was a boundary and an opportunity folded into the same sentence. He could be sorry, or he could be useful. I told him I had always found useful to be the better of the two. To his credit, he took it. I heard later that he was good at it, that the same obsessive attention to detail that had made him a tyrant at a doorway made him a genuinely careful mentor when it was pointed at the right target. People can surprise you if you give them a door instead of a sentence. I will tell you that I did not expect it to take, and I said as much to Sandra. A man does not unlearn 26 years in a single hard conversation and a reassignment to a program he would once have considered beneath him. But I have been doing this long enough to know that you do not change people with a speech. You change them by handing them a task that requires them to practice being different, over and over, until the practice becomes the person. That is what command is when it is done right. It is not inspiration. It is repetition. I gave Gaines a few hundred repetitions of looking a junior officer in the eye and learning their name. And somewhere in the middle of those repetitions, the looking stopped being an act of penance and started being a habit. In a habit, practice long enough is indistinguishable from a character. The other reconciliation came on my father's porch near the end of that summer. Harold was failing by then, gently, the way a long day fades into evening. I sat with him a lot in those weeks, and on one of those afternoons, with no story to prompt it and no audience to perform for, he said the thing he had not been able to say at the kitchen table in 1985, or at my commissioning in 1991, or at any of the ceremonies in between. "I was wrong about you, Ruthie," he said. "I was wrong from the start. I thought I was protecting you. I was just too small to see you." I had waited 35 years to hear some version of that, and the strange thing, the thing I did not expect, was that by the time it finally came, I no longer needed it. I had built a whole life without it. But needing a thing and being glad of it are two different matters, and I was glad of it all the way down. I told him he had not been too small. I told him he had taught me to outlast the people who got me wrong, and that he had been, in his own backwards way, the best teacher I ever had, because he had gotten me wrong first, and made me strong enough for everyone who got me wrong after. He laughed at that, a wet old laugh, and held my hand, and we watched the light go down over the same Ohio fields where he had once told me the army was no place for a girl. I drove home from my father's house that evening in the dark, and I cried a little on the highway, which I had not done in years, and they were not sad tears exactly. They were the tears of a person setting down a weight she had carried so long she had stopped noticing it was heavy. For 35 years, some small, stubborn part of me had been flying every mission and earning every star, partly to prove a man at a kitchen table wrong. And now the man had said it himself, and the strange hollow that opened up where the proving used to be was not grief. It was room. It was space I could finally use for something other than the argument. When I told Sandra about it later, she said something that has stayed with me. She said I had gotten everything I ever wanted out of a life in uniform, and that I had never once raised my voice to get it. That was always the plan, I told her. I just had to live long enough for the rooms to catch up. Time has a way of sorting people that no complaint or campaign ever could, and in the months after the gala, I watched it sort everyone involved into the shape they had earned. Grace Albright rose. I would love to tell you that I made it happen, but the truth is I only opened a door, and she walked through it like she had been waiting her whole life for someone to leave it unlocked. She finished her mentoring rotation and went back to her unit and started leading the way I had seen her behave in that anteroom, with the kind of decency that makes junior soldiers run toward an officer instead of away from one. The last time I saw her, she carried herself like someone who had decided she belonged, and I recognized the posture because it was the one Frank Delaney had given me in a cockpit 34 years before. The thing he had handed me, I had handed her. That is the only kind of immortality I have ever believed in. I got a letter from her a few months into her return to her unit, a real letter, handwritten, which almost no one does anymore. She told me about a private in her platoon, a quiet kid from a small town who reminded her of someone, she wrote, though she did not say who. She had noticed him being talked over in a briefing, and she had stopped the briefing and asked him directly for his assessment, and he had been right, and the room had to sit with the fact that the quiet kid had seen the thing no one else had. She wrote that she had thought of me when she did it. I read that letter twice, and then I put it in the drawer where I keep the 4 stars and the recording of the talk my father watched, which is where I keep the few things in my life that turned out to be worth more than they looked. But her future was still wide open and unwritten, and that was the part that stayed with me. She was going to spend the next 30 years walking into the same rooms I had walked into. And some of those rooms were going to have a Preston Gaines in them, a man with a clipboard who would decide who she was before she opened her mouth. I would not always be there to detail her to my headquarters. At some point, she would have to learn the lesson I learned at a kitchen table, that you cannot argue people out of underestimating you, that you can only outlast them. I hoped I had given her a head start. Gaines running his junior officer program was a different kind of satisfaction, the specific, quiet satisfaction of watching a person reform rather than break. I had no interest in his ruin. I never had. A ruined Gaines would have taught no one anything. A reformed Gaines, standing in front of a room of lieutenants and actually seeing them, was worth more than any complaint I could have filed, because every one of those lieutenants was a person he would once have looked straight through. I ran into him once that autumn at a conference, the two of us passing in a hallway full of people who had no idea about the gala or anything that followed it. He stopped. He did not grovel, which I respected, because groveling is just another way of making a moment about yourself. He simply said that the program was the best work he had done in his career, and that he wished he had found it 20 years earlier, and that he understood now why I had given it to him instead of ending him. I told him I had never wanted to end him. I had wanted to use him. He laughed at that, a real laugh, and we shook hands, 2 soldiers who had met at a doorway and somehow come out the other side, as something almost like colleagues. And then there was me, because somewhere in all of this, sitting with my failing father and my oldest friend and a young lieutenant who reminded me of myself, I started to feel the edge of a question I had been avoiding for a while. I am 57 years old. I will not wear this uniform forever. There is a last chapter coming, and I have started to think hard about what I want it to mean. One evening, near the end of the summer, I sat on the back porch of my quarters with Sandra and my husband, Glenn, who had followed my career through a dozen moves and 1,000 nights I came home late, and who had never once asked me to be smaller so that he could feel larger. Glenn poured the wine, Sandra put her feet up. And we talked, the way you talk when the work of a life is mostly behind you and the meaning of it is still being decided. "So what now?" Sandra said. "You've outlasted everyone. Your father said it out loud. The colonel runs a mentoring program. The lieutenant's going to make general before she's 50. What's left for you to wait out?" I did not have an answer for her yet. I looked out over the lights of the headquarters in the dusk, the place where my 4-star flag was folded for the night, and I thought about all the women still sitting in anterooms in buildings I would never enter, certain that no one important could see them. The colonel had never really been the point. The anteroom was the point, and there were 1,000 anterooms. Glenn, who knows me better than anyone alive, did not push. He has spent 30 years learning when to let a question sit, and he refilled my glass and changed the subject to something small and kind. The garden, a neighbor, a trip we kept meaning to take. But later, when Sandra had gone home and the house was quiet, he found me still on the porch and sat down next to me and said the only thing that needed saying. He said that I had spent my whole life making sure no one had to wait in a hallway alone, and that whatever I decided to do with the years I had left, it would almost certainly be some version of that, because it was the only thing I had ever really been doing, in or out of a uniform. I told him he was probably right. I did not say any of that out loud that night. I just sat with the question and let it stay unanswered a little longer, the way the best questions deserve to be. The answer arrived the following spring, almost a year after the gala, at a commissioning ceremony where I had been asked to speak. For most of my career, when someone handed me a microphone, I had used it to talk about the mission, the soldiers, the work, anything but myself. I had spent a lifetime letting my record do the talking and keeping my own story folded up small. But that morning, standing backstage and looking out at a few hundred brand new second lieutenants, all of them terrified and proud and certain the whole world was watching them, I decided to do something I had never done. I decided to take the podium on purpose and tell the truth. I did not tell them about the night a colonel sent me to wait with the aides. I never have in public, and I'm only telling you now. The story was never meant to be a weapon I waved around, but I told them the lesson underneath it, which was the only part that ever mattered. I told them that some people in their careers would decide who they were before they opened their mouths. I told them it would happen when they were lieutenants, and it would still be happening when they were generals, because rank does not fix it, and the stars on your shoulder do not stop a certain kind of person from looking straight through you. I told them that they would not be able to argue those people out of it, that they would waste years of their lives if they tried, and that the only thing that ever actually worked was to do the work, keep showing up, and let the room catch up on its own time. The truth, I told them, is the loudest thing in any room, and it never needs your help. It only needs your patience. I told them about the coats, finally, not as a complaint, but as a kind of inheritance I wanted to pass to them honestly. I told them that they would be handed other people's coats, in a manner of speaking, and sometimes literally, that they would be mistaken for the help and the spouse and the note-taker, and that the temptation in those moments would be to announce themselves loudly, to produce their credentials, to make the room admit its mistake on the spot. I told them that temptation was natural and almost always wrong. The credential that matters is not the one on your shoulder. It is the one in your conduct, accumulated over years, until one day the room turns and sees the whole of you at once and wonders how it ever missed you. That kind of recognition cannot be demanded. It can only be earned and then waited for. I have found it to be worth the wait every single time. And then I told them the second half, which is the half I think my father finally understood on that porch. I told them that the goal was not to become the kind of person who finally gets the recognition they were denied. The goal was to become the kind of person who never denies it to anyone else. I told them that every one of them would someday stand at a doorway, holding a clipboard, with the power to decide whether the unknown person in front of them was worth their attention, and I told them that who they were in that moment, when they thought no one important was watching, was the only measure of an officer that had ever meant anything to me. I looked out at all those new gold bars catching the light, the way my own had caught it on a spring day in 1991, with my father in a suit that did not fit. And I thought about how many of those young officers would someday stand where I was standing, and how a few of them, the best few, would be the ones who never made anyone wait in a hallway. We do not exist to produce generals. We exist to produce the kind of people who, given a doorway and a clipboard and the power to dismiss a stranger, choose instead to look up. Grace Albright was in the audience that day, a lieutenant no longer terrified, and I watched her hear it. Somewhere in the back, I was told, Preston Gaines was there too, a changed enough man to come and listen. Frank Delaney sat in the front row and beamed like the instructor he had been to me a lifetime ago. I named no one. I settled no scores. I just said the truest thing I knew and stepped back from the microphone. My father did not live to see that spring, but in his last good season, I had brought him a recording of an earlier talk, and my mother told me later that he watched it twice, and that the second time he turned to her and said that their daughter had turned out to be the best of all of them. June told me that the way you hand someone a gift you have been saving. I keep it where I keep the 4 stars. He was right, I think, in the end, which is a strange thing to say about a man who spent my childhood being wrong about me. He was right that our family produced something good. He was just wrong, for a long time, about which one of us it would be, and about what good looks like, and about whether it could wear a uniform. People can be wrong for decades and still arrive, late and breathless, at the truth. I have made a career of betting on exactly that. So here is what I have come to believe, after 35 years and one rainy night at a gala. There is a kind of revenge that is loud and fast and feels wonderful for about an hour, and then leaves you exactly as empty as it found you. And there is something else, something quieter and slower and far more durable, which is simply to be seen, at last, on your own terms, by people who finally bothered to look. I have had both. I promise you the second one is better. If they ever send you to wait with the aides, if a man with a clipboard ever looks straight through you and decides you are nobody, I want you to remember a 57-year-old woman in a dark cape who had 4 stars on her shoulders and said nothing at all. Go quietly, do your work, be kind to the frightened person in the chair beside you, and let the room catch up. It always does. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. I would love to know what you think. If you had been standing in my place in that hallway, would you have dropped the cape and revealed your rank right there? Or would you have let the room figure it out the way I did? Have you ever been underestimated by someone who decided who you were before you said a single word? And do you think I was too easy on Colonel Gaines or was giving him a way to be useful the right call? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and the stories you share stay with me. If this one meant something to you, take a moment to like and subscribe. And remember, the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who outranks everyone in it.